Sir, I need to verify these documents.
Huh?
Is there a problem?
Everything should be in order.
The terminal lights buzzed above him, cold and clinical, as he stood at the first-class counter with his boarding pass in one hand and his daughter's small fingers wrapped around the other. He had flown through this airport more times than he could count, though almost never through this door and never like this. Tonight, he wore a plain gray coat, no watch, no rings, nothing that whispered of the life he had built. His daughter, 7 years old and full of questions, looked up at him with the kind of trust that only children carry, unaware that the next few minutes would test everything her father believed about the world he had spent 20 years constructing. The gate agent barely glanced at him before speaking. "Sir, you've been randomly selected for secondary screening. Please step aside." He did not argue. He simply nodded, took his daughter's hand, and stepped to the side. What the gate agent did not know, what no one in that terminal that night could have possibly imagined, was that the man standing quietly at the edge of the counter owned the very airline whose uniform she wore. He had built this company from a single leased aircraft and a stubborn refusal to quit, working his way through boardrooms that never expected to see him twice, into an empire that now carried millions of passengers across the country every single year. Tonight, in his own airport, standing in his own terminal, surrounded by his own employees, he was invisible, not respected, not recognized, just another face to be moved out of the way. And what happened in the next 10 minutes would end up costing someone their career, exposing a truth about his company that he never wanted to face, and teaching his daughter a lesson about power and dignity that neither of them would ever forget. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Julian Rhodes, though almost no one in that terminal would have recognized it, and even fewer would have connected it to the airline whose logo was stitched onto every uniform around him. Julian had spent the better part of 2 decades building a reputation as a man who valued substance over spectacle, a founder who preferred quiet boardrooms to magazine covers, and a father who wanted his daughter, Zoe, to grow up believing that character mattered more than the size of a bank account. He had made a habit, every few months, of traveling without an entourage, without announcement, without so much as a company badge, simply to see his airline the way an ordinary customer saw it. Tonight was supposed to be one of those quiet nights, a father and daughter flying home from a weekend trip, nothing more. He had no idea that within the hour, that quiet night would unravel into something far more consequential. The questions began to surface almost immediately, questions that would follow Julian and Zoe through the rest of that evening and into the weeks that followed. Why had the gate agent singled him out of a line of dozens of other passengers, many of them dressed far more casually than he was? Was it a coincidence, a routine security procedure applied evenly, or something else entirely, something rooted deeper in the culture of the company he had spent his life building? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, the one that would keep viewers of this story wondering long after it ended. What would Julian do next? Would he reveal who he truly was on the spot, or would he choose a quieter, more calculated path, one that would ultimately reshape the very airline that bore his name? Zoe tugged at her father's sleeve, her voice small but curious, asking why they had to step aside when no one else around them seemed to be stopped. Julian knelt down to her level, his voice steady, and told her that sometimes people make assumptions about others before they know the full story, and that the most important thing a person could do in that moment was stay calm and pay attention. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way, decades earlier, long before he owned a single airplane, back when he was a young man standing in line at ticket counters just like this one, being overlooked and occasionally dismissed outright. Tonight, however, the roles had reversed in a way no one in that terminal could have predicted, and Julian understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly what was about to unfold. To understand what was happening at that counter, you have to go back 30 years to a small apartment above a laundromat in Baltimore, where a 9-year-old Julian Rhodes watched his mother work double shifts as a hospital custodian while his father drove a delivery truck 6 days a week. Money was tight, but ambition in that household was not. Julian's mother kept a single framed photograph on the wall, a picture cut from a magazine of an airplane cutting through clouds, and she used to tell him that one day he would ride in one, not because someone gave him a ticket, but because he built the airline himself. It was the kind of dream a struggling family tells itself to survive the hard nights. But for Julian, it planted something that never left him. By the time he was 12, he could name every commercial aircraft that flew overhead just from the sound of its engines. Julian's path to that dream was neither straight nor easy. He worked as a baggage handler through college, loading suitcases onto the same kind of planes he once dreamed of owning, watching pilots and executives walk past him without so much as a glance. He studied aviation logistics at night, took on debt most of his friends thought was reckless, and spent his 20s failing at 2 different startup ventures before a regional cargo company finally gave him a chance to prove his instincts were sound. He was underestimated at almost every turn, passed over for promotions he had earned, and questioned by investors who could not quite explain why a young black man from Baltimore made them uneasy discussing numbers in the millions. Julian never spoke publicly about those early insults. He simply kept a mental list of every door that closed on him, and used that list as fuel. There was one story from those early years that Julian rarely told publicly, though he shared it often with Zoe as she grew older. During his time as a baggage handler, a senior executive at the airline he worked for had walked past him on the tarmac one winter evening, dropped a heavy suitcase at his feet without a word of acknowledgement, and complained loudly to a colleague that the ground crew seemed to be getting slower every year. Julian said nothing in the moment, loaded the suitcase as instructed, and went home that night and wrote in a notebook he still kept locked in his office desk decades later, a single sentence that would define the rest of his career. He wrote that he would build something one day where no one who worked for him would ever have to feel as small as he felt on that tarmac. That notebook, worn and yellowed with age, sat in the top drawer of his desk at Rhodes Air headquarters, a private reminder of the promise that started everything. The years between that tarmac and the founding of his first charter service were filled with a kind of quiet persistence that rarely makes for dramatic storytelling, but shaped Julian more than any single triumphant moment ever could. He took night classes in business administration while working full days, often surviving on only a few hours of sleep, and spent his limited free time studying the operational failures of larger airlines, convinced that there was a better way to run a company that served ordinary people without treating them as an afterthought. He pitched his first business plan to 11 different investors before finding a single person willing to take a chance on him, a retired logistics executive named Edward Grant, who later told Julian that he had funded the venture not because he was certain it would succeed, but because he had never met anyone who spoke about airplanes with the kind of reverence Julian did in that first meeting. Edward's early investment, modest by industry standards, became the seed that eventually grew into Rhodes Air. By his early 30s, Julian had scraped together enough capital, credibility, and stubborn will to lease his very first aircraft, a single mid-size jet that he used to launch a regional charter service connecting smaller cities that larger airlines had abandoned as unprofitable. It was not glamorous work. He often loaded cargo himself in the early years, negotiated directly with airport authorities who doubted his company would survive its first winter, and slept more nights in his office than in his own bed. But the charter service filled a real gap, and word spread quickly among smaller communities that finally had reliable air access again. Within 5 years, that single lease jet had become a fleet of 12, and what started as a scrappy regional operation was beginning to attract the kind of attention that changes a man's life permanently, for better and for worse. The airline that would eventually carry his name, Rhodes Air, was born out of a merger Julian orchestrated in his late 30s. absorbing two struggling regional carriers and rebuilding them under a single identity built on reliability, fair pricing, and a company culture he insisted must treat every passenger with dignity regardless of what they were wearing or how they looked. Julian wrote that value into the company's founding documents himself, a personal promise rooted in every memory of being overlooked in his own youth. He hired aggressively from communities that other airlines ignored, built training programs meant to root out the kind of bias he had experienced firsthand, and insisted that every new employee, from gate agents to pilots, sit through a session personally designed around his own life story. It was, in his mind, the surest way to prevent his airline from ever becoming the kind of company that had once dismissed him. By the time Julian turned 45, Rhodes Air operated in over 60 cities, employed more than 11,000 people, and had made him, quietly and without much media fanfare, one of the wealthiest self-made men in the country. He avoided magazine covers, declined most interview requests, and structured his public image so carefully that most Americans who flew his airline every week had no idea the company was founded, and still led, by a black man who had once loaded their luggage for minimum wage. Julian preferred it that way. He believed that if his company succeeded on the strength of its service rather than the story of its founder, it would prove something far more powerful than any headline ever could. That belief was about to be tested in a way he never anticipated. Zoe had come into Julian's life later than most fathers experience parenthood, born when he was already 42 and deeply immersed in scaling Rhodes Air into a national carrier. Her mother had passed away from an aggressive illness when Zoe was only 3, leaving Julian to raise her largely on his own while running a company with thousands of employees and a fleet of aircraft crisscrossing the country daily. He made a decision early on that no matter how demanding the business became, he would personally accompany Zoe on trips whenever possible, refusing to let assistants or nannies replace the small, ordinary moments a father and daughter share at airport gates and window seats. It was during one of these ordinary trips, a simple weekend visit to her grandmother's home in Charlotte, that the two of them found themselves standing at that first-class counter, about to become the center of a night neither of them would forget. What made Julian's habit of traveling incognito so unusual was not vanity or paranoia, but a genuine desire to experience his own company exactly as an ordinary customer would. Every few months, stripped of any executive markers, he would book a flight under a variation of his legal name, dress plainly, and quietly observe how his staff treated passengers who carried no obvious markers of wealth or status. He had done this dozens of times over the years, occasionally uncovering pockets of excellence he personally rewarded, and occasionally uncovering failures he quietly corrected without ever revealing his identity to the employees involved. Tonight was meant to be one of those routine, low-stakes evaluations, nothing more than a father wanting to model good customer service standards from the ground up. He had no reason to believe this particular evening would become anything other than ordinary. The gate area that evening was busier than usual, packed with delayed passengers rebooking flights after storms had grounded several earlier departures across the East Coast. Julian and Zoe had arrived nearly 90 minutes early, as Julian always insisted, giving them time to sit near the window and watch aircraft taxi across the runway, while Zoe asked her usual stream of questions about how planes managed to stay in the air. When their boarding group was finally called, Julian took Zoe's hand and approached the first-class counter, his boarding pass already displayed on his phone, his daughter's small rolling suitcase trailing behind them both. It was an unremarkable moment, the kind repeated thousands of times a day in airports across the country, except for what happened in the next 60 seconds, which would ripple far beyond that single gate. The gate agent that evening was a woman named Carol Bennett, a 12-year veteran of the airline industry who had transferred to Rhodes Air only 8 months earlier after a merger absorbed her previous employer. Carol scanned Julian's boarding pass,
Sir, I
glanced
need to
briefly
verify
at
these
his plain
documents.
gray coat and
Is there a problem?
unremarkable appearance,
Everything
and
should be
without
in order.
hesitation informed him that he had been selected for additional screening, a process that would require him to step aside while other passengers boarded ahead of him. Julian asked, calmly and without any edge in his voice, whether this was a standard security procedure or something specific to his ticket. Carol's response was brief and dismissive, suggesting it was simply routine, though her tone carried an unmistakable impatience, as though the question itself was an inconvenience she had not expected to field. What made the moment sting deeper than a simple procedural delay was the pattern Julian noticed unfolding around him as he stood aside with Zoe. Several other first-class passengers, dressed in clearly branded luxury attire and carrying designer luggage, boarded without a second glance from Carol or her colleagues. Julian said nothing about this discrepancy in the moment, choosing instead to observe quietly, a habit built from years of professional discipline that had served him well in boardrooms far more hostile than this gate. Zoe, however, noticed the difference immediately, tugging at her father's sleeve and asking, in the innocent and unfiltered way only a child can manage, why the other people did not have to wait like they did. Julian felt the question land harder than he expected, not because it embarrassed him, but because he realized his daughter was absorbing a lesson about the world far earlier than he had hoped. A few feet away, an older woman waiting in the priority boarding line had noticed the exchange and shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether to say anything. She would later become one of the few outside witnesses Angela Cross's team interviewed during the internal review, describing to investigators how visibly different Julian's treatment had been compared to every other passenger she watched pass through that same counter within a short span of time. At the time, however, she said nothing, and Julian did not expect her to. He understood, from decades of similar moments throughout his life, that bystanders rarely intervene in situations that do not directly involve them, not necessarily out of indifference, but out of an uncertainty about whether their intervention would even be welcome. He filed the woman's reaction away quietly, another small data point in an evening that was slowly revealing itself to be far more significant than a simple scheduling inconvenience. Zoe, for her part, had grown increasingly quiet as the minutes passed, her earlier curiosity replaced by a kind of watchful stillness that unsettled Julian more than any comment from Carol or Brandon could have. She had begun studying the faces of the adults around her with the intense, focused children sometimes reserve for moments they sense are important, even if they cannot fully articulate why. At one point she asked her father, in a whisper clearly meant only for him, whether they had done something wrong. Julian knelt down immediately, took both of her hands, and told her, with as much certainty as he could manage, that she had done absolutely nothing wrong, and that sometimes grown-ups needed to be reminded of that same lesson themselves. It was a small moment, easily missed by anyone not paying close attention, but it would stay with Julian long after the investigation concluded, a reminder of exactly what was at stake beyond the corporate policies and training manuals. As the minutes passed, Carol's colleague, a younger gate agent named Brandon, joined her at the counter and began speaking about Julian in a lowered voice that was not quite as discreet as they believed. Julian overheard fragments of the conversation, comments suggesting they doubted his ticket was legitimately purchased in the first-class cabin, speculation about whether his payment method would even clear, and a passing remark about needing to double-check his identification more thoroughly than usual. Julian remained silent throughout, his expression calm, though internally he recognized the exact pattern of assumption he had spent his entire adult life trying to eliminate from his own company's culture. He had built training programs specifically designed to prevent this scenario, and yet here it was, unfolding in real time, directed squarely at him and his young daughter. The breaking point came when Carol asked Julian to step to a side counter for what she described as identity verification. a request that is not standard procedure for routine security screening and typically reserved for situations involving suspected fraud or ticketing irregularities. Julian complied without protest, still choosing to observe rather than intervene, while Zoe stood beside him, growing visibly anxious at the shifting tone of the adults around her. It was at this side counter that Carol asked Julian, in a tone that left little room for misinterpretation, whether he was certain he had booked the correct cabin class, implying directly that a man dressed as plainly as he was could not possibly belong in first class. The comment hung in the air for a long moment before Julian responded, his voice measured but firm, simply stating that he was certain and asking to see a supervisor. The request for a supervisor seemed to catch Carol off guard, as though she had not expected pushback from a passenger she had already mentally categorized as unlikely to complain. She informed Julian that a supervisor would take several minutes, given how busy the gate area was that evening, and suggested he simply wait at the side counter with his daughter until someone became available. Julian agreed, kneeling down once more to reassure Zoe that everything was fine, that sometimes adults needed extra time to sort out paperwork, and that she had done nothing wrong by asking her earlier question. Internally, however, Julian was no longer simply observing as a curious founder testing his own airline. He was now witnessing, firsthand and without any illusions, exactly how deeply certain assumptions had embedded themselves into the daily operations of the company that bore his name, and he understood that whatever happened next would require far more than a quiet correction behind closed doors. The supervisor who eventually arrived at the side counter was a mid-level operations manager named Stephen Marks, a longtime employee who had risen steadily through the company's ranks long before the merger that brought Rhodes Air into existence. Stephen greeted Julian with practiced courtesy, the kind reserved for smoothing over customer complaints without actually addressing their substance, and asked what seemed to be the trouble. Julian explained calmly that he had been asked to verify his identity and ticket class without clear justification, while other passengers boarded without scrutiny, and that he would like to understand the specific criteria used to select him for this additional screening. Stephen's answer was vague, citing unspecified internal protocols that he could not fully detail, a response that told Julian everything he needed to know about how deeply this pattern had been normalized within his own company's culture. Rather than escalating the confrontation publicly, Julian made a decision that would define the following weeks of investigation. He calmly asked Stephen for the names of every employee involved in the interaction, thanked him for his time, and boarded the flight with Zoe once his identity was, unsurprisingly, confirmed without issue. Throughout the flight home, Julian said little, watching his daughter fall asleep against his shoulder while his mind worked through what he had just witnessed. He was no longer thinking as an ordinary passenger who had been inconvenienced. He was thinking as a founder who had just discovered a fracture in the very foundation he believed he had built carefully enough to prevent exactly this kind of failure. By the time the plane landed, Julian had already decided that this incident would not end quietly. The following Monday, Julian initiated what would become one of the most extensive internal reviews in Rhodes Air's history, though he deliberately kept his personal involvement in the original incident confidential from everyone except his most trusted senior counsel, a longtime friend and general counsel named Angela Cross. Angela pulled security footage from the gate that evening, interviewed staff under the guise of a routine customer service audit, and began compiling a pattern that extended far beyond a single frustrating interaction. What she discovered was troubling. Carol's decisions that night were not isolated, nor were they simply the result of one employee having a bad evening. Internal complaint records, largely unaddressed and buried in a customer service database rarely reviewed by senior leadership, revealed dozens of similar complaints filed over the previous many months, nearly all involving passengers of color being subjected to additional scrutiny that white passengers in identical ticket classes rarely experienced. Angela's team spent nearly 2 weeks combing through the complaint database, cross-referencing passenger demographics with the nature of each recorded incident, a process that required pulling data most executives at Rhodes Air did not even know existed in such granular detail. What emerged was a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Passengers with certain characteristics, regardless of their actual ticket class or payment history, were flagged for additional screening at a rate far higher than other passengers flying in identical cabins. Angela cross-checked these findings against staffing schedules and discovered that the pattern intensified specifically at gates staffed by employees who had joined the company through the recent merger, employees who had never received the original onboarding curriculum Julian had personally designed years earlier. The data told a clear story, one that no single employee's individual bias could fully explain on its own. Angela also uncovered internal emails, exchanged among a small group of regional managers, that revealed a troubling attitude toward the customer complaints being filed. Rather than treating each complaint as an opportunity to investigate a potential training failure, several managers had dismissed them collectively as oversensitive passengers misunderstanding standard security procedures, a conclusion reached without ever actually reviewing the specific circumstances of each incident. This pattern of dismissal, Angela noted in her final report, was almost as concerning as the original behavior itself, because it meant the company's internal feedback systems, designed specifically to catch problems like this before they escalated, had failed at every single level between the front line and senior leadership. Julian read that section of the report twice, sitting alone in his office late into the evening, before finally understanding the full weight of what had happened beneath his own watch. As the investigation deepened, red herrings began to surface that initially misled Angela's team into believing the problem was isolated to a handful of poorly trained employees at that specific gate. Early data suggested Carol and Brandon were simply undertrained transfers from the recent merger, unfamiliar with Rhodes Air's stated values, and the obvious solution seemed to be additional sensitivity training paired with disciplinary action. But as Angela dug further into training records, she uncovered something far more consequential. The training materials themselves, the very documents used to onboard employees company-wide following the merger, had been quietly altered well over a year earlier, stripped of the bias prevention modules Julian had personally written into the original curriculum, and replaced with a generic, watered-down version focused almost entirely on efficiency metrics and boarding speed. This discovery reframed the entire investigation. It was no longer simply a story about two undertrained gate agents making poor decisions on an ordinary evening. It was a story about how an entire company culture, carefully built over 2 decades to prevent exactly this kind of injustice, had been eroded from within, quietly and deliberately, without Julian's knowledge or approval. Angela's team traced the altered training materials back to a specific department, and further still to a specific executive who had signed off on the changes during a broader cost-cutting initiative following the merger. The trail led directly to a name Julian recognized immediately, a name that belonged to someone he had trusted implicitly for over a decade, someone who had sat across from him in countless leadership meetings discussing the very values that had apparently been dismantled under his watch. The executive at the center of Angela's findings was a man named Douglas Kane, Rhodes Air's vice president of operations, who had joined the company nearly a decade earlier and quickly become one of Julian's most trusted lieutenants. Douglas had overseen the operational integration of the merger that expanded Rhodes Air into a national carrier, and it was during this period of rapid growth that the original bias prevention training modules were quietly stripped from the onboarding curriculum. When Angela presented her findings to Julian, the explanation Douglas eventually offered was not born from malice in the way a dramatic villain might operate, but from a colder, more bureaucratic logic that Julian found almost more disturbing. Douglas had determined that the original training modules, The deeply personal sessions built around Julian's own life story were, in his words, inefficient, consuming valuable onboarding hours that could otherwise be spent on operational metrics tied directly to quarterly performance reviews. Julian sat across from Douglas in a private conference room, the same conference room where the two of them had once mapped out the company's expansion plans together, and asked him directly whether he understood what those training sessions represented. Douglas's response revealed the deeper problem entirely. An executive so focused on efficiency and growth metrics that he had genuinely convinced himself the human cost of removing those safeguards was negligible, an acceptable trade-off for smoother onboarding numbers. He had not intended to create a culture where employees like Carol and Brandon would treat a founder or any passenger with the kind of casual disrespect Julian experienced at that gate. But intention, Julian reminded him, had never been the standard by which impact should be measured, a principle Julian had built his entire company around and had apparently failed to protect adequately as the business scaled beyond his direct oversight. The revelation forced Julian to confront an uncomfortable truth about his own leadership. He had built Rhodes Air's culture around deeply personal values rooted in his own painful history. But as the company grew from a scrappy regional carrier into a national operation with thousands of employees, he had gradually stepped back from the day-to-day enforcement of those values, trusting senior leaders like Douglas to protect what he had built. That trust had been misplaced, not through outright betrayal in the traditional sense, but through a slow erosion of priorities that placed efficiency above the human dignity Julian had always insisted must come first. This was, in many ways, a harder truth to sit with than simple villainy would have been, because it meant the failure belonged not only to Douglas, but to Julian himself, for allowing the distance between his values and his company's daily operations to grow as wide as it had. In the days following the confrontation with Douglas, Julian found himself returning repeatedly to a question that had no comfortable answer. He had spent 20 years building a company explicitly designed to prevent the kind of treatment he experienced as a young baggage handler, and yet somewhere along the way, without his direct knowledge, the very safeguards meant to protect that mission had been quietly dismantled by someone operating well within the normal boundaries of corporate decision-making. Douglas had never once acted with open malice, had never expressed anything resembling personal prejudice in the years Julian worked alongside him, and yet the outcome of his decisions had produced exactly the kind of harm Julian had dedicated his life to eliminating. This realization forced Julian to expand his understanding of accountability beyond simple villains and victims, toward a more uncomfortable truth about how systems quietly fail even when no single person intends for them to. Julian spent several long evenings that week speaking privately with Angela about how to prevent this kind of erosion from happening again as the company continued to grow. Together, they designed a new oversight structure, one that required any changes to core training curriculum to pass through a dedicated review board reporting directly to Julian rather than through standard operational channels alone. It was a structural solution to what Julian now understood was not merely a personnel problem, but a governance problem, one that had allowed well-intentioned efficiency decisions to quietly override values that were supposed to be non-negotiable. Julian later described this period to Angela as the most important leadership lesson of his career, more valuable in some ways than the original founding of the company itself, because it forced him to confront the limits of his own oversight as Rhodes Air had grown far beyond what one person could personally monitor. Zoe, meanwhile, had no knowledge of the corporate investigation unfolding around her, though she continued asking her father occasional questions about the airport incident in the weeks that followed, questions Julian answered honestly but carefully, choosing his words to teach rather than to alarm. He explained to her, in terms she could understand, that sometimes people build good systems, but those systems can break down if no one keeps watching them closely, and that recognizing a mistake honestly is always better than pretending it never happened. Zoe listened intently, and one evening asked her father directly whether the woman at the airport would get in trouble. Julian considered the question carefully before answering that the goal was not to punish one person, but to fix the deeper problem so that no other family would ever have to experience what they did that night at the gate. Julian's response to the crisis, once the full scope of the problem became clear, surprised nearly everyone within Rhodes Air's senior leadership, many of whom expected a swift and public termination of Carol, Brandon, and possibly Douglas as well, accompanied by a carefully worded press statement designed to protect the company's reputation. Instead, Julian called a private meeting with Carol and Brandon individually, revealing his true identity to each of them for the first time since that evening at the gate. Carol, visibly shaken upon realizing who she had been speaking to weeks earlier, offered an immediate and emotional apology, admitting that she had made assumptions about Julian based on his appearance that she now recognized as deeply unfair. Julian listened without interrupting, then explained to her, calmly, that his goal was not to humiliate her, but to understand how deeply the training failures had shaped her instincts on the job. Rather than terminating Carol and Brandon outright, Julian made the decision to have both employees undergo the very training modules he had personally rebuilt from the ground up, restoring the original bias prevention curriculum that had been quietly stripped away under Douglas's leadership, and expanding it further to include real accountability measures tied directly to customer complaint data. Douglas's situation was handled differently. Julian determined that a leader who had knowingly dismantled a core value of the company, regardless of his stated intentions, could not remain in a position overseeing thousands of employees, and Douglas was ultimately removed from his role, though Julian chose to handle the departure privately rather than through a public firing designed to generate headlines. Julian believed, perhaps controversially to some observers, that the goal was long-term cultural repair, not a satisfying public spectacle of punishment. Months later, Julian returned to that same airport gate, this time without concealing his identity, accompanied once again by Zoe, now old enough to understand far more of what had happened than she had that original evening. Carol, still employed with the company and now serving as a lead trainer for the restored onboarding program, happened to be working that gate when Julian and Zoe approached. The two of them exchanged a brief, quiet acknowledgement, not dramatic or performative, simply a nod between two people who had each learned something painful and necessary from that original encounter. Julian later reflected privately to Angela that this quiet moment, rather than any public reckoning, represented exactly the kind of change he had hoped to build, one rooted not in punishment, but in genuine, lasting correction. The story of that night at the gate never became public in the dramatic way many assumed it eventually would, largely because Julian insisted on handling the matter internally rather than through a press release designed to burnish his own reputation as a champion of fairness. Word did eventually spread quietly through industry circles, however, of how one airline founder had used a deeply personal humiliation as the catalyst for a company-wide cultural overhaul rather than a simple public relations exercise. For Julian, the entire experience became something he discussed openly only with Zoe, a story he retold to her periodically as she grew older, not as a tale of triumph over villains, but as a lesson about how even carefully built systems require constant vigilance, honest self-examination, and the humility to admit when something you built with good intentions has quietly gone wrong beneath your own watch. Looking back on that evening now, one question remains worth sitting with. Julian Rhodes had every justification to react in anger that night, to reveal his identity immediately and demand consequences on the spot. Instead, he chose patience, observation, and a longer path toward genuine repair. Was that restraint a reflection of extraordinary character, or simply the privilege of a man who knew he held the power to fix things eventually, on his own terms and in his own time? And if you had been standing at that counter yourself, watching your own child absorb that lesson in real time, would you have shown the same restraint Julian did, or would you have demanded justice immediately, whatever the cost? What do you think you would have done if you were in Julian Rhodes's position that night? Let us know in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear your perspective on this story. And if this story moved you, wait until you hear what happened when Zoe, years later, uncovered a hidden letter her father had written the very night of that incident, a letter that revealed feelings he never shared with anyone else. Subscribe now so you never miss that story, and thank you for watching until the very end.